Relativism is the concept that points of view have no absolute truth or validity within themselves, but they only have relative, subjective value according to differences in perception and consideration. As moral relativism, the term is often used in the context of moral principles, where principles and ethics are regarded as applicable in only limited context. There are many forms of relativism which vary in the degree of controversy. The term often refers to truth relativism, which is the doctrine that there are no absolute truths, i.e., that truth is always relative to some particular frame of reference, such as a language or a culture. Forms of relativism. Anthropological versus philosophical relativism. Anthropological relativism refers to a methodological stance in which the researcher suspends his or her own cultural biases while attempting to understand beliefs and behaviors in their local contexts. This has become known as methodological relativism, and concerns itself specifically with avoiding ethnocentrism or the application of one's own cultural standards to the assessment of other cultures. This is also the basis of the so-called EMIC and ethic distinction, in which an EMIC or insider account of behavior is a description of a society in terms that are meaningful to the participant or actor's own culture. An EMIC account is therefore culture-specific, and typically refers to what is considered common sense within the culture under observation. An ethic or outsider account is a description of a society by an observer, in terms that can be applied to other cultures, that is, an ethic account is culturally neutral, and typically refers to the conceptual framework of the social scientist. Philosophical relativism, in contrast, asserts that the truth of a proposition depends on the metaphysical, or theoretical frame, or the instrumental method, or the context in which the proposition is expressed, or on the person, groups, or culture who interpret the proposition. Methodological relativism and philosophical relativism can exist independently from one another, but most anthropologists base their methodological relativism on that of the philosophical variety. Descriptive versus normative relativism. The concept of relativism also has importance both for philosophers and for anthropologists in another way. In general, anthropologists engage in descriptive relativism, whereas philosophers engage in normative relativism, although there is some overlap. Descriptive relativism assumes that certain cultural groups have different modes of thought, standards of reasoning, and so forth, and it is the anthropologist's task to describe, but not to evaluate the validity of these principles and practices of a cultural group. It is possible for an anthropologist in his or her fieldwork to be a descriptive relativist about some things that typically concern the philosopher, but not about others. However, the descriptive relativist's empirical claims about epistemic principles, moral ideals and the like are often countered by anthropological arguments that such things are universal, and much of the recent literature on these matters is explicitly concerned with the extent of, and evidence for, cultural or moral or linguistic or human universals. The fact that the various species of descriptive relativism are empirical claims may tempt the philosopher to conclude that they are of little philosophical interest, but there are several reasons why this isn't so. First, some philosophers, notably Kant, argue that certain sorts of cognitive differences between human beings are impossible, so such differences could never be found to obtain in fact, an argument that places a priori limits on what empirical inquiry could discover and on what versions of descriptive relativism could be true. Second, claims about actual differences between groups play a central role in some arguments for normative relativism. Finally, the anthropologist's descriptive account of relativism helps to separate the fixed aspects of human nature from those that can vary. And so a descriptive claim that some important aspect of experience or thought does vary across groups of human beings tells us something important about human nature and the human condition. Normative relativism concerns normative or evaluative claims that modes of thought, standards of reasoning, or the like are only right or wrong relative to a framework. Normative is meant in a general sense, applying to a wide range of views. In the case of beliefs, for example, normative correctness equals truth. This does not mean, of course, that framework relative correctness or truth is always clear, the first challenge being to explain what it amounts to in any given case. Normative relativism therefore implies that things are not simply true in themselves, but only have truth values relative to broader frameworks. Postmodernism and relativism. The term relativism often comes up in debates over postmodernism, poststructuralism and phenomenology. Critics of these perspectives often identify advocates with the label relativism. For example, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is often considered a relativist view because it posits that linguistic categories and structures shape the way people view the world. Stanley Fish has defended postmodernism and relativism. These perspectives do not strictly count as relativist in the philosophical sense, because they express agnosticism on the nature of reality and make epistemological rather than ontological claims. Nevertheless, the term is useful to differentiate them from realists who believe that the purpose of philosophy, science, or literary critique is to locate externally true meanings. Important philosophers and theorists such as Michel Foucault, Max Stirner, political movements such as post-anarchism or post-Marxism can also be considered as relativist in this sense, though a better term might be social constructivist. The spread and popularity of this kind of soft relativism varies between academic disciplines. It has wide support in anthropology and has a majority following in cultural studies. It also has advocates in political theory and political science, sociology, and continental philosophy. It has inspired empirical studies of the social construction of meaning such as those associated with labeling theory, which defenders can point to as evidence of the validity of their theories. Advocates of this kind of relativism often also claim that recent developments in the natural sciences, such as Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, quantum mechanics, chaos theory and complexity theory show that science is now becoming relativistic. However, many scientists who use these methods continue to identify as realist or post-positivist, and some sharply criticize the association. Related and contrasting positions. Relationism is the theory that there are only relations between individual entities, and no intrinsic properties. Despite the similarity in name, it is held by some to be a position distinct from relativism, for instance, because statements about relational properties assert an absolute truth about things in the world. On the other hand, others wish to equate relativism, relationism and even relativity, which is a precise theory of relationships between physical objects. Nevertheless, this confluence of relativity theory with relativism became a strong contributing factor in the increasing prominence of relativism, whereas previous investigations of science only sought sociological or psychological explanations of failed scientific theories or pathological science. The strong program is more relativistic, assessing scientific truth and falsehood equally in a historic and cultural context. Relativism is not skepticism. Skepticism superficially resembles relativism, because they both doubt absolute notions of truth. However, whereas skeptics go on to doubt all notions of truth, relativists replace absolute truth with a positive theory of many equally valid relative truths. For the relativist, there is no more to truth than the right context, or the right personal or cultural belief. So there is a lot of truth in the world. Theater and relativism. Theatrical research and performance studies also utilize methodological relativism, formerly referred to as method acting. The idea that an individual or group of individuals conducts research on a particular fictional or non-fictional situation, in an effort to repurpose these situations for dramatic effect. Many approaches have been derived to bring the ethic as close as possible with the EMIC, and one can arguably state that the research done by Stanislavski, Meisner and physical theater all emerge from this same science. Through repeated training with different strategies, an actor commonly seeks to embody the EMIC under intense scrutiny, utilizing numerous tools such as a script, dramaturgy and their own personal capabilities to bring a character or situation to life through the suspension of disbelief. Catholic Church and relativism. The Catholic Church, especially under John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI, has identified relativism as one of the most significant problems for faith and morals today. According to the Church and to some theologians, relativism, as a denial of absolute truth, leads to moral license and a denial of the possibility of sin and of God. Whether moral or epistemological, relativism constitutes a denial of the capacity of the human mind and reason to arrive at truth. Truth, according to Catholic theologians and philosophers, consists of ad equatio rei intellectus, the correspondence of the mind and reality. Another way of putting it states that the mind has the same form as reality. This means when the form of the computer in front of someone is also the form that is in their mind, then what they know is true because their mind corresponds to objective reality. The denial of an absolute reference, of an axis mundi, denies God, who equates to absolute truth. According to these Christian theologians, they link relativism to secularism, an obstruction of religion in human life. Leo XIII. Pope Leo XIII was the first known pope to use the word relativism in the encyclical Humanum Genus. Leo XIII condemned Freemasonry and claimed that its philosophical and political system was largely based on relativism. John Paul II. John Paul II in Veritatis Splendoris is immediately evident. The crisis of truth is not unconnected with this development. Once the idea of a universal truth about the good, knowable by human reason, is lost, inevitably the notion of conscience also changes. Conscience is no longer considered in its primordial reality as an act of a person's intelligence, the function of which is to apply the universal knowledge of the good in a specific situation and thus to express a judgment about the right conduct, to be chosen here and now. Instead, there is a tendency to grant to the individual conscience the prerogative of independently determining the criteria of good and evil and then acting accordingly. Such an outlook is quite congenial to an individualist ethic, wherein each individual is faced with his own truth, different from the truth of others. Taken to its extreme consequences, this individualism leads to a denial of the very idea of human nature. In Evangelium Vitae, he says, freedom negates and destroys itself, and becomes a factor leading to the destruction of others, when it no longer recognizes and respects its essential link with the truth. When freedom, out of a desire to emancipate itself from all forms of tradition and authority, shuts out even the most obvious evidence of an objective and universal truth, which is the foundation of personal and social life, then the person ends up by no longer taking as the sole and indisputable point of reference for his own choices the truth about good and evil, but only his subjective inchangeable opinion or, indeed, his selfish interest and whim. Benedict XVI in April 2005, in his homily during Mass prior to the conclave which would elect him as Pope, then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger talked about the world moving towards a dictatorship of relativism. How many winds of doctrine we have known in recent decades, how many ideological currents, how many ways of thinking. The small boat of thought of many Christians has often been tossed about by these waves, thrown from one extreme to the other, from Marxism to liberalism, even to libertinism, from collectivism to radical individualism, from atheism to a vague religious mysticism, from agnosticism to syncretism, and so forth. Every day new sects are created, and what St. Paul says about human trickery comes true, with cunning which tries to draw those into error. Having a clear faith, based on the creed of the Church, is often labeled today as a fundamentalism, whereas relativism, which is letting oneself be tossed and swept along by every wind of teaching, looks like the only attitude acceptable to today's standards. We are moving towards a dictatorship of relativism which does not recognize anything as certain and which has as its highest goal one's own ego and one's own desires. However, we have a different goal. The Son of God, true man. He is the measure of true humanism. Being an adult means having a faith which does not follow the waves of today's fashions or the latest novelties. A faith which is deeply rooted in friendship with Christ as adult and mature. It is this friendship which opens us up to all that is good and gives us the knowledge to judge truth from false, and deceit from truth. On June 6, 2005, Pope Benedict XVI told educators, "Today, a particularly insidious obstacle to the task of education is the massive presence in our society and culture of that relativism which, recognizing nothing as definitive, leaves as the ultimate criterion only the self with its desires. And under the semblance of freedom it becomes a prison for each one, for it separates people from one another, locking each person into his or her own ego." Then during the World Youth Day in August 2005, he also traced to relativism the problems produced by the communist and sexual revolutions, and provided a counter-argument. In the last century we experienced revolutions with a common program expecting nothing more from God. They assumed total responsibility for the cause of the world in order to change it. And this, as we saw, meant that a human and partial point of view was always taken as an absolute guiding principle. Absolutizing what is not absolute but relative is called totalitarianism. It does not liberate man, but takes away his dignity and enslaves him. It is not ideologies that save the world, but only a return to the living God, our Creator, the guarantor of our freedom, the guarantor of what is really good and true. Criticisms. A common argument against relativism suggests that it inherently contradicts, refutes, or stultifies itself. The statement, "all is relative," classes either as a relative statement or as an absolute one. If it is relative, then this statement does not rule out absolutes. If the statement is absolute, on the other hand, then it provides an example of an absolute statement, proving that not all truths are relative. However, this argument against relativism only applies to relativism that positions truth as relative, i.e., epistemological, truth-value relativism. More specifically, it is only extreme forms of epistemological relativism that can come in for this criticism, as there are many epistemological relativists who posit that some aspects of what is regarded as factually true are not universal, yet still accept that other universal truths exist. Another argument against relativism posits a natural law. Simply put, the physical universe works under basic principles, the laws of nature. Some contend that a natural moral law may also exist, for example as argued by Richard Dawkins in The God Delusion and addressed by C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity. Dawkins said, "I think we face an equal but much more sinister challenge from the left, in the shape of cultural relativism, the view that scientific truth is only one kind of truth and it is not to be especially privileged." Philosopher Hilary Putnam, among others, states that some forms of relativism make it impossible to believe one is in error. If there is no truth beyond an individual's belief that something is true, then an individual cannot hold their own beliefs to be false or mistaken. A related criticism is that relativizing truth to individuals destroys the distinction between truth and belief.